Hi guys, and welcome back to another video. So we are going to be doing some watercolor painting today. So I pulled out my larger watercolor pad, which is about, I don't remember the size even though it was just on the screen. I think it's 15 by 10, but the only painting that I've really done on this piece of paper pad, or whatever you want to call it, was this one of Ike, which I will link down in the description if you would like to see the painting session for this one. But here's kind of like a size comparison, my two hands plus my A5 sketchbook or notebook, so you can see how large this kind of piece of paper is. So this is a paper pad, so it is gummed on all sides, minus this little center part where you can slip in some kind of like a blade or some kind of sharp edge tool to kind of free the paper from the rest of the stack. But today we are going to be painting a illustration in watercolor of Elira and Selen, which are from Niji En, and they are like a pair of dragon sisters from Niji, basically, and they're VTubers. But so I did my sketch in Procreate first because I didn't want to really damage or ruin the paper by too much erasing and sketching. So I'm going to transfer the sketch from my Procreate file to printer paper, and then printer paper to my actual watercolor paper. So here I'm showing you guys kind of like the little steps that I took to kind of figure out how I wanted to position Elira and Selen. So I have Elira in the front, Selen in the back, and I didn't plan anything for a actual background, so I decided to leave it as kind of like wisps or just like some kind of texture that kind of resembles a little bit like clouds in the back. And I wanted a specific color palette, and I totally forgot to do a color comp before we actually started to do painting, so that's my mistake, but I feel like the illustration turned out pretty cute regardless, so I got a little bit lucky. So for the sketch, I printed it off by kind of like tiling method. So I have two A4 sheets of paper, and I basically cut them down to the appropriate size, make sure to have a little bit overlap. I also have these little notches on my pieces of paper so that I can actually tape it to my watercolor paper stack without having to bend the pieces of paper, and then it will prevent it from having any buckling or anything like that. But before we get into actually taping that to my watercolor paper pad, we are going to need some kind of method to transfer my sketch. So I did this in the past before, where I've actually taken my Prismacolor Col-Erase first, and then I will basically shade the entire back side of the paper. And the reason why I'm doing this and I'm not doing the light box method or transferring it that way is because my watercolor paper is attached fully to the watercolor paper block, so it's impossible for me to paint it on the block while being able to use a light pad underneath, because I can't shove that underneath if my paper stack is kind of all together. So once I've kind of shaded the entire backside with the Prismacolor Col-Erase, you can just use normal graphite at this point, or whatever you have that would leave an imprint. You can just put that on the backside. I just shaded it where the area where Elira and Selen are. And then after that, taped it to the watercolor paper pad, and we can move on to the actual transfer part. So if you're familiar with carbon paper, this is basically like the makeshift way of doing like a carbon copy of, let's say, writing or a drawing in this case. So I'm taking a ballpoint pen, and I'm going over my digital sketch that I have printed on the kind of like copy paper, and using a ballpoint pen, it just gives me a sturdy enough drawing utensil to leave a hard enough mark so that I can transfer my pencil mark or pencil kind of like rubbing onto the watercolor paper. Now I'm trying to use not too much pressure so that I'm indenting the watercolor paper itself, because the watercolor paper is a bit on the softer side, but I'm using enough pressure so that I'm leaving some kind of an imprint. And this is also similar to when people get that ghosting, or your pencil sketches in your sketchbook kind of like imprint on one another due to the fact that you don't have like a piece of paper separating them, or because you're pressing too hard, so each of the little graphite marks will basically press into the next page. So it's basically like that. So I find that's kind of like the makeshift way of being able to transfer your sketch if you want to not draw directly onto the watercolor paper and have a bunch of guidelines and wanting to erase too much. So because I don't want to lose my sketch and I want to make sure that I have the lines fairly clear and clean, I want to do a pencil sketch on top of the transferred sketch, because the transferred sketch is a little bit patchy, it's a little hazy, it's also not very defined. So I'm going ahead and using just a normal mechanical pencil with the kind of like HB lead in 0.5, and I'm just going ahead to kind of like retrace the lines, making sure that they're clean. I'm not making any sketchy lines. I'm trying to be as confident as I can and leaving as much detail as I need for the future line work that we are going to do for the painting as well. So I know some people might be a little bit apprehensive to actually use, let's say, graphite for their watercolor painting sketches and stuff, because sometimes you can pick up that loose graphite and accidentally smudge it around whenever you're doing washes or mixing colors. Sometimes you might get a little bit of that kind of like muddier color or like that grayish color bleeding into your nice watercolor washes, and it just makes things look muddy. So it's best if you can either do your sketch in a color that you don't mind pushing around too much. Sometimes even using colored pencils, which have a bit of a harder lead, leave a little bit less loose graphite. Try to swipe away any loose graphite before adding your washes, or you can even go over your sketch really lightly with a kneaded eraser to pick up all that loose graphite kind of hanging out. So now that I've kind of have my sketch done with the pencil, and you can see a little bit of that red peeping through from the Prismacolor Col-Erase, but to kind of seal my graphite a little bit, I am going to do a wash of water. So you're actually going to probably see just ever so slightly a little bit of my sketch looking a little bit smudged. Now I don't really mind because I know a lot of it will be covered up anyways, but if that bothers you, make sure to take a little bit of proper care before you actually do this step. But I always find that doing kind of like a wash of water on top of graphite does make it a little bit harder for the graphite to budge or move later, so I won't really have to worry about reactivating that or pushing around more excess graphite after I add in my kind of layers of water. And I'm adding a little bit of a wash of yellow. Now I mentioned that I forgot to do kind of a color palette or a color comp prior to painting, so I added yellow first because usually when I do paintings like this, I actually gravitate towards a lot more of like warmer compositions, warmer color palettes, and it just felt a little bit too much. I don't know if it's me just like automatically putting down a yellow wash, but that's what I ended up doing. But I did want to have a little bit more of like a purple, pink, and blue in the background, so I kind of wanted purples and pinks to be on the left side where Elira was, because she has a little bit more of that blue color, and then I wanted more kind of blue and a little bit of pinkish purple peeping through onto the right, because Selen is mostly purple, so I didn't want them to blend into their own backgrounds too much, so I wanted to kind of spread it around. Now, because I didn't really have a plan, I was kind of messing around with how I could do the textures of the background. So initially I kind of wanted to treat it more like clouds, but the more kind of shapes I was painting in with the paint, I'm realizing that I was making it overly too dark, and I didn't want it to gradually get darker and darker, so I started to lift up the paint from the paper and use a paper towel to kind of blot away to make sure that pigment is kind of lifting from the paper. So after that, I am going to move along and start to paint the figures. So I'm going to start from left to right mostly. So I'm going to start to paint Elira first, and then we'll move on to Selen. And I haven't painted with watercolors properly probably since the Ike painting, I think. Might have been the last one that I did, so it's been a few months, and even working on this paper just feels a little bit different. It's not labeled as hot pressed paper, but it's definitely much smoother than cold pressed paper. It says it has more like of a natural texture, but for the most part it's like super smooth. It's also 100% cotton, but I started to notice that I needed to be a little bit careful when I was building up some of the layers. So you can see that it's actually quite easy for me to lift up the paint. So I was brightening up kind of like the left side of Elira's face a little bit, where her nose is and kind of the cheek, so that we can give a little bit more dimension to her face, while I kind of build up the right side a little bit more. But when I was layering up colors, I do have to be careful that I'm placing colors down rather than reactivating the old paint, because it's been super easy to reactivate it. And for the most part, I've been kind of like switching back and forth between two of my watercolor palettes. Now, my usual main palette that I tend to use for watercolors is the Holbein watercolor paints, and there's a little bit of like Grumbacher, there's a little bit of M. Graham & Co, and even some Winsor & Newton Cotman series, but I've been really liking using them in conjunction with, I believe it's the Paul Rubens set, and it's just like the color selection just gives me a little bit more variety. I also just like the pigments from that set as well, so I've been kind of just switching back and forth. In terms of the brush, I do not remember, actually let me grab it really quick. So this is the number 0 Leonard 100 RO Lavis Fauve brush. Now I'm not sure if that's the official name, but I don't remember where I got this brush actually, or like when did I pick it up. I just found it in my jar of brushes and I started painting with it, and I absolutely love this brush. It can hold so much water and it makes it quite easy for me to like maneuver my brush strokes, do larger washes, pick up like pigment, put down paint, but also the point on it actually is very sharp, which I absolutely love because I am such a lazy painter. Other than the background where I used a larger 2-inch Hakke brush, and then I kind of used a few other kind of smaller round brushes to do some of the kind of like smaller details and adding colors into the background. I like to only really use one brush for the most part for the majority of the painting, and because this one can do larger washes quite easily but also come to a nice point, I can kind of do all my large areas and all my smaller areas all at once, and I don't really have to think about switching brushes. But later on when we actually start doing the line work, because this brush holds so much water, I rather pick a brush that holds a little bit less water so that I can get a good consistency of a water to paint ratio when I'm doing the line work, so we can get something like really sharp. So in the beginning, I mentioned that I was going to record this process for an ASMR video, but I noticed, and you probably saw it a little bit in the beginning, that you saw my mic maybe in frame every so often. So it was a little bit tedious finding time to get good lighting, but also record in a setting that has less just background noise, so like no people talking, less traffic, all that jazz. And it was okay at the start, but the problem is that my drawing strokes, my painting strokes, everything was just way too quiet for my mic to actually pick up properly to give me actual good like ASMR or background noise, because I feel like the only noise you're really gonna hear is when I actually start to rinse out my brush on the jar. So it'd be like a tapping of a jar noise or swishing of water every so often. But because I don't do it too often, it feels like you're just gonna sit in silence, which I feel like is not exactly what people might want. I don't know if it's because of my mic. I don't have it super close to the paper when I'm painting just because of the lighting, that you can't really hear it, or it's the way that I'm placing down my brush onto the paper that it doesn't create any like swooshing noises. Let me see if I can give you guys like a quick little sample. I'm not sure if I'm going to turn up my mic. I'll pull up like a scrap piece of paper and a brush next to my mic and see if you can hear it. So I feel like if you hear this sound, it makes a lot of sense. But oftentimes when I'm painting, other than the initial washes, you can see while using this brush, if I'm only using the tip, so I'm gonna do the noise right now. It's a little bit too soft, but also because my mic's not gonna be right against my paper, you're probably not gonna be able to hear it. So I decided to scrap the idea of making this one an ASMR video. I'll see if I can do some other session. So like either another marker session, we can do another like graphite session, or something like an inking session. Because I know some people wanted to, like me, to do another one where I was going to be using maybe the dip pen, because it kind of gets that nice scratchy noise on the paper surface. But we'll see, because I don't know. I feel like graphite's usually the easiest, or pencil crayon. Marker's not too bad. I just have to be careful placing down the markers every so often. So if you are up this point in the video, do let me know if you want any kind of ASMR videos of like a particular medium. Then I'll definitely try to tailor it to that, because I love making traditional art, kind of like ASMR videos more recently. The digital ones are like, they're nice to film and stuff, but I feel like because they get a little bit repetitive in terms of either the way I'm inking it or because I go on autopilot mode super easily, it feels too samey, if that makes sense. But I'll still do them every so often. So hopefully when you guys see this video next week, I think literally a week from today's video, I'll have a ASMR video probably of, I don't know how to say his name. It's either Riosly or Ricely. I don't know how to say his name, but it's the Genshin cop guy from Fontaine. And hopefully I'll do an ASMR version for him and or Farina, I think. Maybe. We'll see. We'll see who I'm comfortable drawing that day and if I can plan out an actual like illustration, composition, and everything for that. So let's talk a little bit more about the watercolor process. So when painting for Elira, she does have a little bit of a lighter color palette in general compared to Selen. So she has a little bit more of like a white sweater, kind of like cream to beige colored overalls on top of her sweater. But when I'm doing a lot of like wet on wet, I'm trying my best to bleed in some of those other colors into it. So some of the gray colors in her white sweater, I bled in a little bit more of that blue. I tried my best to add in a little bit of yellow into some areas, or a little bit of that pink or beige, so that we can vary it up and kind of get that smoother transition from a wet on wet approach rather than me doing wet on dry, which is usually how I paint things a lot of the time. Or how I'm doing like Selen's hair right here. I do apologize that I actually didn't end up recording a lot for Elira's hair, so hopefully the process of me showing you guys how I painted Selen's hair will give you a little bit of insight. So I started to do a quick wash of kind of like where I would want the highlights to be, and I just did a very light base tone. As we get closer to the face or we get to a lighter area, I tried my best to clean off my brush and get kind of like a wet brush to touch the edge of the wet paint so we can kind of drag that color down and eventually fade it out. So even right here, I tried my best to do where the wet areas are, just trying to drag it out, and then if I can, I will also add some of the darker areas to like, let's say, certain edges so that they gradually will bleed down to the other wet areas, but then stay and remain sharp at the very top. So I kind of chunk it in, so do a base layer, then I'll do initial shadows, I'll do another layer of like darker shadow sometimes, and even one last layer to kind of really push in to those darker areas. But sometimes I usually leave that for even just the line work to take care of, so I don't have to focus too much on like pushing the values when I'm just doing kind of like my first two washes of the color. But yeah, watercolor is something I've been really missing lately, and I don't know if it's because like I stopped doing a lot of portraiture traditionally on a larger scale that I haven't done any watercolor painting, nor have I done a lot of like chibis that were done very quickly and I needed to color them in such a way, because I used to use a tiny little watercolor journal that's about, I think it's like A5 size, and it's like a landscape one. And I would use a Koi travel watercolor set, and it had 18 colors, I think. And I would use the tiny brush that came with it, and it had these little, kind of like, they look like chiclets, if people know what that gum is. And they look like those little tiny, it's on like a very flimsy plastic tray, and it has these little squares of watercolors, I guess. And I would use those to paint everything. But I never really realized how little I guess like how well I could spread the color out if I did wet on wet and allowing the colors to kind of bleed and mingle with each other, which you can see here. What I did was doing that for Selen's tail as well, so we kind of have that cooler, darker purple, then we kind of go into more of a warmer, kind of pinkier purple, and then eventually fade that all the way out. But I do like to take advantage, if I can, of wet on wet when I can. So either to transition from a darker color to a lighter color, or transition from one hue to another hue. It just makes it a little bit more natural. And I don't mind as much anymore of the kind of like splotchy look where you kind of have the edges of the watercolor being a little bit darker, and in the center where the water probably was pooling, it's a lot lighter. So I just have to learn that eventually I will just build up more and more layers and it might become a little bit less apparent, but also just kind of trying my best to embrace the fact that watercolor has that, and it's very nice to see in a lot of artworks where you can see the kind of like little imperfections that come with like certain traditional mediums and stuff, because I do miss that look whenever I do digital work with that's kind of like imitating watercolor, and it doesn't really have the same exact reaction because you don't get sometimes that darker outside and softer kind of lighter inside of a wash. But I really like that look sometimes, so trying my best to embrace it because I do miss using watercolors a lot, and I feel like at some point digital has like overtaken a lot of my time working with traditional media, but also working with gouache. I liked that because it was just felt more graphic, while watercolor has a nice like softer look, or if you can take the time to really build it up, you can get a little bit more graphic or build up that contrast. But I feel like it was because I didn't like how I did the line work for any of my watercolor painting anymore, partially due to the brush as well. I was very stubborn to not really upgrade any of my brushes or to get new brushes, so I was using a lot of brushes that have been beaten down to the point where the tip of the hairs were no longer forming a point. It would form like more of like a very dull dome at the top, so I could only produce like very thick lines. And whenever I do line work, which hopefully I'll show you guys in a bit after I finish up adding a few shadows here and there to Selen's pants and some other areas where I might add a few more shadows, I'll be able to show you guys which brush I'm using to do the line work. And I do like doing the line work with watercolor as well, so I don't have to fuss around with using a pen or have the, I guess, like having a harder time matching the colors to certain areas of my piece. So speaking of watercolor, or not watercolor, speaking of line work or line art, so I switched to the Artex travel sized brushes. So they came in a pack of 2. I believe it's like a size, maybe a size 4 and a size 8 or size 6. I do have them here, so let me see if they have the numbers on them. It says number 2 and number 8. So I'm using the number 2 brush, which has fairly small bristles, but it comes to a really nice point. But the way, if you look at the brush, doesn't hold as much water as you would think. So it makes it really easy for me to get a certain consistent consistency from a kind of like paint to water ratio. So I'm able to get a really sharp line and a good kind of consistent line when I'm doing the line work. So I'm trying my best to do longer strokes. I'm also trying my best to not really squish down on the brush too much so that I don't produce overly large lines, if that makes sense. So I'm basically really just using the tip of the brush so I can get as fine of a line as I can. But like I said, the ratio of water to paint is quite important, because if you have a lot of water in your brush and it starts to pool at the tip, once you make contact with the paper, you might just end up with a blob or a really thick application of your paint and water, which might not produce the kind of line quality that you might like. Which is kind of like the reason why I'm not entirely used to using like a water brush. A lot of the artists actually I really like that like does a lot of watercolor either use a kind of like squirrel hair mop brush to do a lot of their stuff, or they use water brushes. But I feel like I struggle too much with water brushes because I'm not able to control how wet or dry my brush hairs are on the tip of the brush itself. So if you're using a water brush, usually the water, I don't know, you can, like, what do you call that? The water barrel, I guess, of the brush would be kind of like leaking in water to the bristles so that you can paint on the go. You don't have to carry around water or anything like that. It's really nice to use when you have to do like large washes, but to get thinner lines, I've seen people do it, but I'm just very poor at doing it. So I prefer to keep a separate brush for this. So in the past, I would use like a script liner brush as well. I find that using a smaller size brush, like a size 2 or 4, works really well. I used to use a size 8 and a size 6 for the majority of my paintings anyways, so I would use that as long as it can do a nice sharp point. But yeah, moving on, I showed that I was actually using a little bit of white gouache here and there. So I'm adding a little bit of sparkles, a little bit of highlight. Now, even though I'm able to use my brush to pick up some of the excess paint off of certain areas, some places like Selen's teeth, I decided that I would just paint in white rather than lifting up the skin tone from the teeth, because I just didn't really want to budge the line work that I already did, so I didn't really want to pick it up. And then instead of picking out my gouache palette, I also just mixed a little bit of my watercolors with the excess white gouache that I had to do some of the details on Selen's little keys around her neck. And after that, I did the background a little bit, added some sparkles, a little bit of kind of like white dots to kind of give it a little bit of like dust and kind of cute little lighting, I guess, and a little bit of like petals here and there. But I think that's it for the illustration for now. So yeah, so this is kind of like what it looks like at the very end. You can see the intensity of the colors. I do like the contrast between Elira and Selen from the background. Also, don't do what I'm doing. Make sure whenever you're using a knife or any sharp object like this, please cut away from yourself. This is bad, like, X-Acto knife etiquette, or whatever you want to call this. Always cut away from yourself. I'm an idiot here and starts cutting towards myself, so if I accidentally slipped my hand, it would basically run into my other hand and I would probably cut myself or stab myself. So please be careful and make sure to always use your knife away from you rather than towards you, okay? So that's just, you know, basic X-Acto knife etiquette. Okay, so here is the finished artwork alongside with my sketch. So with the X-Acto knife, you can also use like a blade or whatever you have to pry away the gummed edges of your paper from the rest of the paper pad. So that's what I was using the X-Acto knife for. But yeah, this is the finished artwork. And here's the other one I did of Ike from a previous session. And these two, I think, turned out pretty cute. I'm quite happy with how it turned out and glad I didn't stop in the middle and actually completed it all. So yeah, hope you guys enjoyed today's little painting session. I know it's quite of a long video and I tried my best to incorporate as much footage as I can, but yeah, I'll talk to you guys next time in the next video. Bye!